Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to CCS and Baithak. Today's Baithak, the topic of our conversation is Reconciling Experiential and Intellectual Learning with Barun Mitra and Amit Chandra. So, what I have done is most of you already know Barun and Amit in some capacity, and I have looked through the internet to find their bios just for the purposes of people who may be watching on YouTube later, and some of you who may not know Barun and Amit. I've customized their bios for purpose of today's topic. Nothing is fiction. All of it is real. So keeping that in mind is just much more relevant part of it. So Barun is a thinker and a writer, always trying to explore ways to translate ideas into possible actions. His key interest is to find ways of generating political capital from the ideals of liberty, peace, and prosperity in order to make those principles and policies socially and politically viable. He firmly believes that the strength of citizenship lies in being able to engage actively on public issues without being an expert. Sovereignty of citizens depends on this capacity to engage. Since 2017, he has been associated with grassroots farmers organizations on a range of agricultural issues. Early in 2019, Barun had taken the initiative to draft a Farmers Manifesto for Freedom. And in the summer of 2019, he was part of the Kisan Satyagraha in Maharashtra, where farmers publicly sowed unapproved GM cotton seeds to express their demand for access to latest technology in agriculture. So between 2010 and 2016, Barun worked with ARCH Vahini in Gujarat to help poor forest-dwelling communities claim their property rights over land and local natural resources and develop a web platform to implement the Forest Rights Act 2005. Yeah. So that was the relevant part for Barun. Now, Amit, I'll introduce you. Okay. So Amit is a passionate promoter of liberal values with an interest in improving governance in the area of school education and livelihoods. Yeah. He is a social development professional with experience in research, advocacy, and outreach, and his work has played an important role in helping design the following public policies discourse in India: National Urban Street Vending Act 2014, amendments to Indian Forest Act 1927, amendments to Micro, Small, and Medium Enterprises Development Act 2006, and initiatives taken under Ease of Doing Business campaign by Government of India. And as most of you know, that Amit was also very, very instrumental in making NISA, setting it up and making NISA the biggest private school entrepreneurs network in the country, and setting up the street vending campaign that CCS has done in the past in Jaipur. So in summary, both Amit and Barun have extensive experience applying the ideas, the liberals, the books that you see behind us, those ideas on ground. Those liberal ideas, those values on the ground, running through campaigns. So, and both with Barun was visiting our office a few weeks ago, and we had this conversation for a couple of hours, and we thought it is good that this conversation is shared with others, and probably also getting feedback from people and generate a larger conversation. So, therefore, the title again, Reconciling Experiential and Intellectual Learning. So, as liberals, most of the time we have we are into books, research, and writing, which is mostly, again, going back to the ideas part of it, the intellectual part of it. Amit and Barun are unique that they're also liberals, not only armchair, but also have, been on the ground quite a bit. So that experiential learning. And therefore, with that, I would like to throw the stage open and invite Barun and Amit to start the dialogue. I'll keep time, and I will also try to keep us focused on the subject. So maybe, Barun, you can set the context and then we can continue.
Thank you. Thanks, Kumar, and thanks, Amit. And thank you all to come and be part of a conversation that has been playing out in many forms that I can think of. The interesting part is that much of our conversation generally is with others. We are, as a citizen or as a human being, the first level of conversation that we really need is with ourselves. And as a liberal, I've spent 25 years preaching liberalism to others. I didn't really listen, not just to those who I was preaching, but also to myself. And therefore, today I'll have to say that much of the bios that Kumar just selected and read out, I could go about scrutinizing much of those. Because that's been part of my journey, particularly in the last 10, 15 years. In fact, it will probably be almost 15 years since this question first came into my mind, that why so much intellectual inputs and outputs in support or in defense of liberty have been so difficult to translate on the ground. And my first experience and my interest in talking to Amit on this, because he was another one who had some experience and we really never had an opportunity to share that. The first question that in 2010 that came to my mind was when I was working with ARCH Vahini in some of the tribal areas in Gujarat and elsewhere. And we were working on the land rights for the poor tribal communities. Because a law had come about 5-6 years earlier, and therefore its implementation. And we generally know that in India there are many laws and the implementation can be poor or pathetic, depending on how you want to interpret it. But what surprised me, and that's when I started realizing that there is something wrong in the way I myself have been looking at it. For instance, we have had, and I'm sure some of you and some of you there, Mr. Das surely would recall some of the earliest seminars, conferences we have had at Habitat Center and India International Center. And one of the issues that was really close to my heart, and it still is this issue of property rights, for instance. What I realized since 2010 was that we never talked about property rights with the poor farmers. They had an instinctive grasp of what was theirs. And what I realize now, in fact, this is to me has been the most challenging and most, in a way, painful as well. What I realize even now particularly, which I didn't realize even 10 years ago, is that we may have done a great disservice by seeking a legal framework to recognize rights and in the process handed over the poorest and the most vulnerable to the power of the state. And I can cite, and this was my interest with Amit's experience, because from a very different sections, the school, the private schools, the budget schools, and the street vending. That whether our approach to liberal ideas, liberal policies through legal changes is helping or hurting. And in fact, I heard it from somewhere else, actually. I think from Kerala, when I last went there 2 years ago. Someone told me that how, for instance, in the case of the street vendors, it's become a de facto license permit Raj of a new identity, exactly as it has happened with all our identities that we all carry in our pockets. That whether our whole approach to liberalism through law, and I'm saying this because I spent 10, 15 years solely on property rights, primarily. Some of you may know, and Kumar and Amit surely, one of the first things in the early 1990s or late 1980s, when I, long before any institutional affiliation as my own intellectual journey, one of the key ideas of the authors that struck me was Hernando de Soto and his land rights, property rights for the poor. Today, 20, 30 years later, I think I have a much clearer understanding as to how such a brilliant idea has been so difficult to implement. In fact, it has worked the other way around. It has made the poorest even more vulnerable to the avarice of those who wield the power of the law. So I will be really interested to hear from Amit, from his own experience, that whether he is able to relate to what I am saying, because it has been in a way, extremely enriching journey. I am happy that I am able to scrutinize myself to that extent, that I am willing to shake my fundamental premises today, which I could never do 30 years ago. I took liberalism for granted. And the reason why this has become to me personally so relevant in the wider context is because across the world today, particularly in the last 10, 15 years, and it is not a coincidence, across the world today there has been a counter-revolution, not just against liberal ideas as such, but an approach to power, to state, to law, which doesn't have or doesn't require any ideology, any political ideology that we generally think in terms of the left or right. All those portraits there are kind of liberals, right? I mean, that's what is the CCS for, to promote and uphold liberal ideas. Today's political ideology has no ideology. There is no left and right. There is an extreme convergence. And that convergence has been on the issue of how to use law and how to wield power through law. And therefore, what I see is an amazing distinction between what we believed rule of law to be, and therefore, in my imagination, there were only two categories. One was rule of law, a prime cornerstone for liberals like us. And the other is lawlessness, the rule of the law of the jungle, or the might is right, that. But today, in the last 10, 15 years, I am beginning to realize, particularly in the last 5 years, I am amazed at how blind I might have been. It seems to me there is a third category, and which is much more important, which is lawfulness, that is tyranny through lawfulness. Everything that happens today happens under the law. And India is going through a classic episode of that today. Everything that is happening under the umbrella of the law, leading us down to a kind of tyranny the world has hardly ever seen before. Because we didn't even have this category called lawfulness. And which is what I realized, which is what I'm saying, that it is extremely painful for me to even think that the time and effort I spent to understand property rights for the poor has actually helped in handing over the poor to the powerful under the ambit of the law. So I'd like to hear, because there has been a very powerful, to me it has been a threatening existential threat to my own identity, because I did not begin from this point. And therefore, I would like to hear.
Right. Let me jump in here. And to further set the context, like Barun and I were thinking about catching up for a long time, and finally we decided to set up 30 minutes to just catch up. And we started talking, and the conversation continued for more than 2 hours, and then we couldn't conclude the conversation, and then we thought, let's do a deeper conversation, record it and put it for all of us. And what I really kind of admired that Barun was bold enough to say in the entire his life journey, the things that he has been able to do, what he or through the work we have been able to achieve, and where we fail. Hardly we find people who would be bold enough to say that here my ideas, I was wrong, bluntly, publicly, and think about alternate ways. Couple of experiences that I have encountered in my journey so far, and let me also kind of distinguish my perspectives, because I'm more of an action oriented, a doer person, and when I observe things happening, not happening, and then I try to connect with ideas and philosophies where Barun and Gurcharan and others have mastery, while Barun is more comes from the idea space, intellectual space, and looks at where it is being applied, not applied, why not applied, etc., etc. And therefore, this conversation becomes important. Now, in my course of work and life so far, both working on education and street vending, where we were talking about rights. Let me start with street vending. When I started the campaign, soon I realized that as long as there are only street vendors part of this campaign, the campaign would never succeed, because it will always be seen as those beneficiaries who are kind of protesting, advocating, demanding to protect their own life, livelihoods, rights, etc., etc. And therefore, if it is really acceptable by the community or not will be the key thing to decide where it goes. And therefore, opening the campaign. So, the target group has not to be just your street vendors and your policy makers, but public by and large, those who benefit from the services. So, community engagement becomes the key. And many a times in our campaign, that piece gets missing. So, the larger framework that I use or see or I have learnt over a period of time, which gives me clue whether any policy solution that we are thinking about will be workable or not workable, is so far I have been looking at 3 P's, what I call 3 P's in the governance space. Any idea issue will have some philosophical background. So, what is the larger philosophy idea behind the subject? Second would be, if there is larger, bigger idea, how the policy is being drafted, and then how this policy is being practiced. So, philosophy, policy and practice, and if there is an alignment. If I see that philosophy, policy, practice all are clearly aligned, then it could be a good policy, we can expect a good impact. If these are not aligned, right, then there will be a problem. Then possibly we won't be able to achieve the set objective that we really want. Now, another P that we realized after conversation that we possibly miss is the people. So, the 4th P that has to be added to the framework is the philosophy, policy, practice, and the people, because everything that we are thinking has to be centered towards the people achieving or not achieving. So, this is the framework I kind of applied in the street vending, in the education domain also with school education. And to give you one example, Right to Education Act, then I will say, in my opinion and many other people who were working on this, when we applied this right-based approach through a law, and in fact, we have seen that it has worked against the objective. So, if the idea was to educate more kids, actually more schools were shut down, the cost of education went up, the engagement or the stakeholders, parents, teachers, schools, principals, all of those working together, I started seeing that there is a divide, even organizations, and now all these stakeholders in some sense are fighting with each other. So, there is so much of animosity created rather than actually creating a coherent, space for dialogue and working together and all of that. Now, here once again I will come pass it on to you, Barun. Now, what do you think about this framework and your comment on this?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree that we didn't have a complete picture. But what he's saying, this last point is, I think, is what is critical to understand this whole idea of rights. As a classical liberal, and Mr. Das would surely agree with me, that we typically looked at rights as positive rights and negative rights. So negative rights is what we thought we possess and others should not encroach. Positive rights, what we thought was somebody else, the state in particular, was creating it for somebody or for me, including me. So right to education becomes not just my right to educate, but somebody else exercising the right to enforce that right to me via others. Yeah. Now this is broadly the negative and the positive rights. What we miss, to me this has been a revelation, a shocking revelation that I could be so blind, is this whole issue, the interface of law and therefore politics and as a consequence power. So there are two more P's to be added, power and politics.
Power and politics.
Because what is a law? Law, as we understand it typically, is an instrument which the state, and we could add that as democratic, even a liberal state, a liberal democratic state, as we would generally consider to be our ideal, that it crafts, firstly drafts the law, and secondly implements the law, enforces the law. The authority of the law is the political power that carries it or is reluctant to carry it, and therefore the implementation can be weak. And all of us can think of innumerable examples where some laws are pursued with vigor by whoever is in political power to do it, and some laws can be just relegated to the background or under the carpet and forgotten. India is full of such laws of both categories. What we never scrutinized, particularly the classical liberals, that we had an abstract notion of rule of law without really appreciating the politics and the power and their relationship with people that's going to shape its operation, its actual practical aspects of it, dimension. Which is why the whole idea of rights, positive, negative, doesn't matter. Whole concept of rights in a way has handed to the state the power to decide which right and whose right to be respected or not. Whose rights are to be privileged, as in positive rights, and whose not. And what he said, the most important thing about what Amit just said, and I'm glad that you realized it quite independent of we having discussed it earlier, is that this approach has set society, segmented society, and set different sections of society against each other. A disaster for societies that claim to be we the people as the sovereign. A tailor-made disaster. We all talk of divide and rule, right? And we generally associate, in India, we will associate divide and rule with the British. And we can easily say, very easy to explain away, that they of course had a reason as a ruler to divide India in order to be able to rule. But it has got nothing to do with the British. This is the essence of power if we are going to hand over the law to the state. So what you are noticing in case of education, the different segments, the parents, the teachers, the whatever, the school management, whatever. I can tell you is happening. In fact, that's what I was told. That was one of my first inclination 2 years ago when I was in Kerala, 3 years ago. Because they said that street vending, that how it has become a vehicle to grant favors or recognize somebody's right and deny somebody else's. I see in the case of the tribal land rights, the property rights. Some people have got rights. Some people have got truncated rights. That is what they said, they didn't get it fully. And some people didn't get any rights. Which is not uncommon for any law to function in India. In most cases, in 99% of legal instances that any one of us can cite, we'll find some places where it has been implemented, some places partly implemented, some places forgotten or lost. But what it has done to society is something which was not in my radar at all, which is that this division is the first state or the first stage of divide and rule. That the tribal community which were united, like the Nisa, once it came through the legal route, it got increasingly divided. The social fragmentation that we are seeing today across the world, over the last 10-15 years particularly, doesn't matter rich country, poor country, developed world or the third world. And the corresponding political polarization that we see, experience on a daily basis, is a consequence of this division. This is an existential threat not just to us individually. This is an existential threat to us as a society, as humanity. Because this seems to me an universal aspect that I am seeing which I was completely blind to. Tyranny through lawfulness.
And if that is possible, how it can be done?
I don't know whether I'm really at a stage where I can suggest solutions to begin with.
No, we'll brainstorm
Yeah,
together. So,
I am more firstly focused, or by happenstance perhaps, on where and how I myself, and by extension many of us, had gone wrong? Because I firmly believe, some of you may not agree that we made a mistake. I believe we made fatal mistakes. Otherwise, we in India and so much of the world would not be in the same boat. And I'll give you another example. Long before all this grassroots activism in the late 90s and early 2000s, and Mr. Das will surely remember, those were the days of the WTO. Big debate, globalization, liberalization, WTO, good or bad. And I and many other liberals with me, we strongly looked at WTO as a potentially beneficial organization for two reasons that I can think of, remember today. One was that it would partly restrict the national governments to their particular avarice, in terms of international trade, playing favor to, favoring one side versus another. And secondly, we thought this would institutionalize international trade, bring it under the framework of a common rule of law, so to say, globally. What we missed out is the other two P's, politics and power, and therefore people and practice. What it did, in my view, this has been one of, if I were to point out the most critical particular instance of my lack of imagination, was in this area, something that I spent almost 10 years in support of arguing for a free trade and looking at WTO as a potential organization to help through it. We ignored power and politics because we thought it will be an international umbrella institution through which power and politics can be restrained, because there will be a common rule of law. Which means we didn't grasp what was rule of law. But most fatally, that actually provided the backdrop or created the ground condition which has made such a universal backlash against international trade and globalization far beyond anything WTO had ever envisaged. Because I remember still, nearly 25 years ago, 1999, some of you may not have been born then. I'm sure you would remember that there was a big protest at WTO in Seattle, one of the first major global protests against globalization. And I was in the streets of Seattle in that week. And we were quite surprised and shocked at what we were seeing. Because here we were arguing for free trade and globalization. Today, I would say that my shock at the protest was a reflection of my own blindness. Because we made it possible. We substituted people and power and politics from law. We tried to, we imagined that we are substituting it. Instead, we created a ground whereby power and politics could come back in a huge way. And this is now quite universal. You don't need a protest. WTO has been defunct for almost 15 years now, or at least 10. It is no longer in a position to decide on anything, except it's the adjudicating body, because that has a structure and momentum of its own. And even that has been blocked, because many countries simply refuse to nominate judges, the adjudicators on that panel. So that panel itself becomes defunct. Yeah. What it has done to me is, and this is why I'm still in the problem side, not on the supply, because we need to understand the problem. We need to really understand the problem. This is to me, this is, like I'm saying, this is an existential threat and identity issue for me, that how we could have done this. we created a monster. Knowingly or unknowingly, that's not an excuse, that doesn't help us. Because we allowed or created, enabled a fertile social condition to grow, which would hit us in this manner. The monster called state. Yeah. And which is where, this is where in 2014, and I don't know, you may still remember, and I do still, there's a book there, Liberalism in India. That book was released in 2014. And Mr. Das and I, we were two of the speakers for a day-long CCS program at that Connaught Place hotel. Yeah, Park Hotel, I think. Yeah, somewhere there. I think Park, Connaught Place. Yeah, somewhere there. Because I still remember it so distinctly. That is when, for the first time in public, I thought of Gandhi. Because here is a man who, to me, became something so unique, only for one thing that I read and realized then. I don't think there's probably, except for maybe few true anarchist thinkers of some era, there is no mainstream political leader anywhere in the world in the last 200-300 years who could conceive, as he did, that every action of the state is a manifestation of violence. Because every action of the state is authored through law, even in liberal democratic states. And therefore, every action of the state that normalizes violence through law, through its institutions of law, is normalizing violence in society. So what I just said a little earlier about the social fragmentation and the political polarization is a consequence of this. Which is why the state is able to play the law, use the law of the rights, positive or negative, either way, to decimate the rights. And society is so divided because some of us who think we'll still enjoy the rights, some of us who think we might still get through or get some extra privileges, and some of us who are outside who we think we might still squeeze in or take the state away from me and get it to him. We have all become footballs in the game that is being played by power and politics. And in that conference, that was my first public utterance on Gandhi 10 years ago. Because that's why I remember, because I was making a transition which I didn't realize even then. I didn't realize even 3 years ago when some of the bios that he read out had said. I could never imagine that I'll come to a stage when I'll have to acknowledge that all my faith, my passion for property rights had led me down the so-called garden path. Yeah.
There is a framework, Barun. Sorry, I should have mentioned at the beginning that at some point of time, very soon in 10 minutes or so, we'll open up so that there can be a dialogue with the audience. And I'm sure some of the conversation may come across as very esoteric and not very directly relatable. So we'll just to, once the audience will ask those questions, then probably it will become clearer. So the framework that I'm thinking about is that until recently and even now, new book has come by Karthik, and he is talking a lot about state capacity, and state capacity has generally been in conversation. I remember Mr. Das when there was he wrote a book and the theory that what we need essentially is a small state but strong state. So essentially state which is not involved in all aspects of our life, but what it does and what it should be doing, it should be doing very well. So that I would say essentially has been the case that classical liberals has been talking about. What you need is a small government, but that government, the essential functions of the government, whether it's rule of law, enforcement of property rights, etc., those should be done in an effective manner. So could it be said that, look, that part of it, the strong state, that limited part, that state does its job well, we have not been able to find a way to get the state doing that part, and maybe if we are able to do that, then this entire thing could be a lot less, difficult. I would add to what Kumar is saying.
Because we can't possibly think of a better solution for now. So, how would you say that? Can we make a
this
case
to
for
me,
this
to me, it's really, it's like I'm looking at my own life and my own intellectual journey as in a film. Just think of three things that we discussed so far. Rights, that's where we began. I almost now 10 years, 9 years, since Liberty Institute, of which I was a part for better part of my life, we began to shut it down. And the key, Liberty Institute had 4 pillars. If any of you, it's no longer there in existence now on the website because we removed all of that. But those of you who remember, like you too, we had individual rights, we discussed rights. Rule of law, I had been talking so much about rule of law and that problem. Now, the issue of limited governments. We had it as the third pillar. Another problem. Because incidentally, I don't want to take this conversation to Gandhi as such today. We can have another occasion to do that. But just to point out that if anybody is interested in knowing what Gandhi thought of the Constitution, you should do some research and look at it. Gandhi wrote his Constitution in his manifesto in 1909, the Hind Swaraj. And in 1945, just as on the verge of India's independence, Gandhi was having a written debate over letters, that is on record, with Nehru on constitutional government, and Gandhi kept insisting that he had written 50 years ago, or 40 years ago then, that the village republic is the only way to save India. And not just India, any society. The village republic is not a geographical location of a village. Village republic is a community where citizens govern themselves. What we missed out, and the reason why I'm not getting into the solution part of it as such yet, because one reason is I'm still thinking, but more critically, because this probably illustrates the fundamental difference in approach that we have had over intellectual learning and experiential learning. Community. It is the experiential learning of the community at the grassroots on whose shoulders the country can be carried. It is not through the institutions imposed on the top to crush the society and the community can a country survive. Power can survive, but not a civilization, not a country. So we must really think. We must, that's what. First, forget anything, whether you agree with me or not, that is secondary. To me, the primary question that I am looking at and I am trying to convey to you, and because both of them are very old friends, 15, 20 years, we know each other in one way or the other. I am trying to force myself to be able to scrutinize myself. I'm not so much bothered about pointing out what others did wrong. I am continuous, that's what I'm saying. 3 of the 4 pillars that I myself had a role in thinking, conceiving, designing, and having in my name card for 25 years, I'm questioning.
Just curious, what was the 4th one? Sound money? What was the 4th pillar?
No, there were only 3.
No, 4. Individual rights, limited government, rule of law,
Property rights.
Free exchange.
Free market.
Free market.
So I'll come to free markets. That will probably be the last one if any of you have a question, because I'm going to question all of that. And what I want, if there is any takeaway from this effort that that we thought of engaging in a wider conversation, to me, I would suggest only one. Not any agreement with me. I'm not concerned. Develop, cultivate, because it will not happen otherwise. I know it from my own experience. Develop and cultivate the capacity to question our own most fundamental beliefs and ideas. Don't take it for granted. Don't take it for granted. I did it. I am a living example of the Himalayan blunders that we have made on the way, and therefore I can say that I cannot shirk my own responsibility, no matter how small. That the mess that we find ourselves in, and it's not just in India, and it's not in India, it's a global phenomenon. Exactly as it was after the Second World War, when the whole world was turning socialist, exactly as it was when the whole world was turning so-called liberal after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And today the whole world is turning upside down exactly for that same reason. We must be able to, first and foremost, be able to question our own beliefs. I'm not getting into the 4th pillar of free market, but that's another one.
Let's have the wider conversation now. Otherwise, it will like हम लोग बात कर रहे हैं आपस में. So I think we have a mic which can go around, and if anyone has a query, question, and clarificatory thing to ask, Amit or Barun, please.
I think Gurcharan was the first question.
Just FYI, Barun said Himalayan blunder, and that has forced him to move to Himalayas, and everyone is seeing in Delhi now. It's being for the
the answer. You raised
No, we can listen to a few more because, because I already said that I'll be somewhat more reluctant to come up with a seventh P, which is a prescription. I'm still a little away from it. So you can count the number of P's. What theory? The nudge, Cass, Cass Sunstein, yeah. Yeah, I'd agree. And that has been, in fact, one of the details of my realization. Nudge theory is Cass Sunstein, like Hernando de Soto. 10 years ago, I would have said that this is such a good idea. Today, I think it's a disaster.
So
just quickly, yeah.
So if state is asking citizens to become good citizen, who is asking state to become a good state? I think that is will be your question.
That's a puzzle.
Yeah.
That's the puzzle.
Yeah.
If any of you have to make a comment on Gulshan's point or what Shavi has asked or point.
If there is no
take that
question,
up
then
as
we
a
can
goal of-
respond. Anyone else?
I think Shadow is talking about the system and process. So someone who kind of
Institution of law.
goes above the law and institution and system, then what about this?
Yeah, this takes me back, say for instance, to one of Hayek's very, what should I say, pithy formulation. That law is customs which are legislated on. Now, just think in the current context in India, there is so much debate about the new law that we are trying to create. Indian Penal Code is now what Samhita? Huh? Nyaya Samhita. Now this word Samhita, can anyone of you, I'm sure many of you will be able to guess, from where has it become so popular or so commonly known? Where have you heard this word Samhita in the legal context? I mean, it's an Indian, an old Indian tradition that all of us are generally familiar with. Yeah, say. I mean, I'm sure all of you have heard of it. It's impossible not to hear of it today. But it's been in our culture for thousands of years. What Samhita? When you hear this word Samhita, which is the prefix that comes to mind? Nyaya Samhita is now the original Samhita, from where at least I became aware of this phrase called Samhita.
I'm not too sure, but if we break the word, it is sam and hip. So the hip of the samaj.
Yeah, that's the Samhita part. But the phrase that is most common today and has been common through a lot part of Indian history and culture is Manu Samhita, right? And it is criticized and it is praised for either reasons. And incidentally, particularly those of you who have studied law, Manu Samhita was just one of the legal texts of ancient India. But what is particularly galling in today's context, in today's India, is that throughout India's 2000 years of recorded history, there was no Indian state that ever adopted Manu Samhita as their governing code. Why? Not because they didn't know about it. They knew about Manu Samhita and they knew of many other legal codes that existed, because it's like the Vedas, there are so many texts. Like all Indian texts, there are many texts. Why? That is where the answer that Shavi asked lies. What is law? Today we take it for granted that law is legislation, and this is what Hayek has been trying to point out, that law is not legislation.
Yeah.
Law is customary practices that society accepts, and some of them get legislated at a particular time because of the social, political, economic context of the day, which is why no Indian state ever in recorded history adopted the so-called Manu Samhita as their governing law. Because no one needed to, everyone selected whatever bits they wanted their time and forgot the rest or left out the rest. From Ramayana, Mahabharata times, that's what it has been through the epics. See the difference. There was no equation of law with the state. Today we cannot even conceive of a law without the state. And those of us who spend so much of our years in policy advocacy, what were we spending time on? On the state creating a new kind of a law. We never could even conceptually question this approach to law, although like me, some of you may have read Hayek and have read that customs, and which is why one of Hayek's principal insights is that the knowledge is dispersed and discrete, and therefore you cannot generalize and create a structure to incorporate all pieces of knowledge in order to provide a framework to solve all the problems. So knowledge is dispersed and discrete, and so are customs, which is why customs vary. Even the caste customs in India varied from district to district or village to village. Every village does not follow the same caste customs, because there is no law. It's custom, which means it's open to change, and this is where the village republic, I think, becomes so critical. Because if we are to conceive, because there are two other elements that Amit mentioned, and you also, community, and something that I have been really thinking, and I am just thinking aloud. How are communities imagined and shaped in practice? And why are smaller communities, a village republic, and again I'm saying the village republic should not generate in our mind the concept of a geographic village as the republic. The concept of a village republic is a community, where it is a relatively small community where people can engage with each other and therefore share each other experiences. It is this shared experience that is critical in crafting the community, for the simple reason that it is in this shared space that existing practices can get questioned. Because it's in a limit, like in this room. In this room, like I am questioning myself, I am encouraging all of you to question ourselves. In a small environment, it is possible. It's not possible at a civilizational scale. Which is why Manu Samhita was adopted or practiced to the extent it was in such a diverse and limited way in virtually every society community in India. They didn't need a law. That is, a legislated law enforced by the state.
Yeah.
Because the biggest assault on the difference between the two is not in law, is in our conception of the linkage between the moral values and their legal manifestations. The more distant we have made the law, the moral roots have virtually decayed. So today, like ask anyone on the street, even lawyers, particularly lawyers perhaps, all of them or most of them look at law as mere instrument. There's no right or wrong about it. It's how do you leverage one particular interpretation to help one client, and if you are representing the other client, then you do the other side. Whereas the whole conception of law was rooted in the shared moral values at the community level, which is why some communities thought and practiced caste discrimination as part of their moral customs and others didn't. Which is where I think if there is any conception of a solution or as a way out that I'm sure all of us, even I am desperately looking for, is how do we reimagine and revive the sense of community, whether it is at our housing societies, RWAs, communities as in a even in an office block, for instance.
Anyways, sorry.
Yeah, that's what. How do we do that? That's the question.
I think this is a big question. We all have to kind of brainstorm, continue thinking about it. And also some of these ideas, it's good to think about it, but also keep it in the parking lot, because when the right time comes, then only these ideas will materialize. But however, we start working on. Now, many of you would also be thinking where this conversation is going, right? In my case, actually, I would say that I have not been completely oblivion of the fact that the laws we are trying to get created can certainly be used or abused against the very same people. And therefore, the best, in my capacity and also with people working with me, we have been continuously thinking about how do we design that law, right? Which also actually limits the power of the people who would actually govern it. And in fact, while we are having this conversation, the immediate big example comes in my mind is, there is one idea that we advocated for under the new national education policy, which is pretty much part of the policy. And we do see that this could be the transformational recommendation. Now,
Which is, for instance, for me, just to remember what is the specific thing that you are mentioning.
Yeah. So, one part of the problem in education space that gives more power to the people in power to manipulate is because there is centralized power, right? So we advocated for could we get these separated and have a regulatory body like try and all in education sector too. Now some of the states have started working on it, and because I'm closely following it up, and that goes with your thinking, my experience has been the states which started working on it are actually working in a manner that goes against the very set objective of the idea. Right? The moment they are thinking about setting up a new regulator, they know that they are creating a body which will regulate them as well. And therefore, right from the beginning, by design, have their own people in governing body. You design in a manner that they are dependent upon the state, and they would most of the time function within the department and not outside the department to become the regulator, right? So I see all of that, because the mindset with which the bureaucracy works is control. They are never thinking about independence, freedom, facilitating that process, giving ownership and all. The idea behind that happens to be, we are the state, and it is in our mandate, it is in our power authority to have control and penal mechanism. So this is what is happening. Frankly speaking,
just one question, that what you are talking of state is in the sense of Indian states.
Indian states.
Not the state as in the state.
No.
Okay, yeah.
As a formation, the Indian states, which represents the idea.
Yeah.
So the key thing is, while we are working and we face this dilemma on day-to-day basis, the best way is think about what provisions you are keeping within the law that keeps state also accountable, that limits its role and power, what function to give to the state and the bureaucrats or people at implementing position, and what not to give, right? So design the policy framework, the law, in a manner that it works for the objective and it works for the community, very people that it is designed for. What would you have to say on this?
5 years ago, I would have agreed. Today, I really cannot agree.
Happy that the framework from 10 years has to move to 5 years.
Yeah, because this is, I really cannot conceive of looking at institutions, no matter how good, well-intentioned or well-designed. That these institutions with their best of intentions and best of design will not fall prey to politics and power, because the people are missing. That's where the community comes in. That our focus has to be, and particularly in the case of education, particularly because you have had such a long exposure and experience with NISA, and having seen the fragmentation of the stakeholders that has happened, I think the primary focus, we can discuss policy, we can discuss all that as part of something that's happening, and you have to provide input and you have an opportunity. So do that by all means. But the primary focus, as I see it, has to be on how to revive a sense of community, because that is the only check.
Definitely.
There is no other check. No institution will withstand. We in India are living through that process. No institution will withstand. In fact, what's worse, I was telling before we started, what's worse, today we are creating a world and a country where one section of society will actually cheer the destruction of the institutions as a symbol of their power and authority. So no institution will survive. Therefore, the question is, and this has been really engaging, and in fact, this is probably one consequence that, that because I am living in a village, literally, with just 200 households, so I am struggling to figure out where is the community of our imagination that we are looking for. It reminds me of Tocqueville, because what you said is only one half of Tocqueville. Tocqueville in his Democracy in America also warns that how this issue of sovereign volunteership, engaged citizenship at the local level is under threat, and that how that this democracy will fall prey to a stronger, bigger, more imaginative, more powerful leader at the top. It may have taken 150 years, but America has headed that way. Because what I'm saying is, and I have in fact, to me it would seem today, not 10 years ago, not 15 years ago, not when Rajiv Gandhi was alive, that the 73rd, 74th Amendment that came in the 90s and was marketed as an outcome of Rajiv Gandhi's dream of local governance, it cannot happen institutionally. I fully believe, not because I am an utopian. In fact, I would think it is that institutional approach that is utopian. Because that institutional approach, no matter how good intentioned Rajiv Gandhi genuinely was, or the limited extent to which 73rd, 74th Amendment have been crafted, have been implemented or not implemented. An institution of that is, our focus is at the wrong end of the stick, as I see it. We are trying to conceive an institution which will deal with a problem that is growing at the social level. It cannot work. Politics and power is leveraging the social alienations to reshape institutions.
So what's the answer?
Yeah, the answer
Civil society.
Civil society in a way that goes far beyond any imagination of civil society.
Where community is at the center.
At the center, in terms of the community being able to imagine itself as we the people. We the people that most of our constitutions today have is just a slogan. Most people, in India, you have written so many columns. My Baap Sarkar. So many times I have seen it in your column. My Baap Sarkar is being crafted institutionally through this legal process of distributing, privileging rights or penalties, whatever. So the question is, and which is a real question, but to me, and today, and this is something I kind of had a sense even in 30 years ago, that the reason why I thought it was so exciting to be in India, not because India was liberalizing, but because India, of all the 40 countries that I have visited in the last 30 years, India to me is the most exciting because it's the only country where the largest section of the population still largely lives laissez-faire.
But we are trying to formalize that.
Correct. I will be destroying it.
Law is formalizing it.
To me, the reason why I was amazed at the scale and scope of the informal sector, and that was the limitation of my imagination too, that I was looking at it as an economic dimension. But it's not. Long before Tocqueville went to America, if you read, and I'm sure you would have read, and in fact, I'll be looking for if you can give me an exact reference because I've forgotten the reference. Europeans visiting India in the 18th centuries or even in the 17th century, writing in Old English, and some of the books are on the internet, were surprised. At what? That Indian community seems to have a life of its own. It didn't depend on the rulers. Rulers came and went, fought and ruled, and their regimes and things collapsed or dissolved into something else. They were so surprised that here were communities that were virtually self-governing And these were people who had come from Europe, from all the political revolutions that had taken place there in the early 18th century. We are surprised to note that. Today we are surprised that there are possibilities of such communities.
There are such communities in Switzerland, for example. Switzerland is a very much down at the bottom is where power really.
Correct. Yeah, very true. Yeah. They have their context. Switzerland came up in the 19th century as a state through convergence of such cantons. Which is why they are the only ones remaining in the mainland Europe, which have 4 languages and 3 religions and all the rest trying to coexist, because they are at the canton level. Now, history cannot be recreated. The question for us, and which is what I think, I don't want to sound pessimistic at all. The reason why I am so keen to engage with him, because unlike me, he still has the opportunity and the time and the place to actually engage in this interface between policy and the people. And he is somebody who has realized it not intellectually from the other side like I did, from his own experience on the ground, that he is seeing how policy is working the other way. And therefore, I will be looking at you and your experiences to figure out, I really mean it, not as a kind of patting your back. I really mean it, because you are still engaged. I am no longer engaged in that detail. The only caution I can tell you is that when we are in the middle of the battle, middle of action, we have no time and space to think of the broader picture. But since you have already realized the tension that exists at the broader level between the policy that is being sought, no matter the good intentions, and the divisions it is causing in the society, in the public, in the community, among the stakeholders. Therefore, the challenge that I would be hoping to learn from your experiences going forward is how you are conceiving this tension and figuring out a way to build the stakeholder communities in a manner that can work as a restraint on the policy and the state. Otherwise, and which is what I said before, that is the key conception of the village republic, that who is going to constrain the state? And our problem is much deeper today. It's not minuscule, as Mr. Das said a few minutes ago, that liberalism has withstood many challenges. The whole world has never faced the challenge of lawfulness, tyranny through lawfulness. We could easily fight against injustice because it was seen as injustice. It was unlawful, immoral. Today we are no longer in a position to do that. The world has not seen this phenomena till perhaps maybe some few incidences of this kind which failed in the 20th century. Before that, the world was clearly divided. Either you are absolute ruler and a tyrant, or you are a more accommodating ruler which had a kind of moral base on which the laws were founded. Those laws can be criticized in today's terms. So, US could have a constitution which included slavery. But it also opened the space for questioning slavery, because it said that life, liberty and pursuit of happiness and all individual inalienable rights, etc., etc. So it had both things. So does Indian Constitution. We have all the written text will have its pluses and minuses. The question for you, and I am really looking at somebody like you, because because I know that unlike Kumar and many others I have engaged, our interactions have been primarily intellectual. When I have engaged with Amit, my primary interest has been to learn from his experiences, because he was coming from a very different context. And therefore, I will be looking at him to understand how is he conceiving and figuring out a way to nurture the stakeholders in the community as the fundamental bulwark against the monster of the state. There is no other way. There is no design element that is going to help it. So I am really looking at you.
Barun is putting a lot on the shoulders of Amit, which is fine.
He is much younger, so I can still look up to him for 20 years.
And we have about 15 minutes more to go. We will take a couple of questions. Saurabh had one and then Jaina.
I completely agree, and in fact the design problem in that I am seeing it even in my village. The fundamental design problem is the law, because the elite can count on the law. The community can only count on themselves, because they do not know which way the law might fall at which time, which politics will favor what implementation of the law. For instance, I am surprised, I am saying this, I am surprised that I am even acknowledging it in front of you, that in the villages that I have been to lately, including the one where I live, many people, including us, we have a kind of a boundary marking. We could say that it is property rights. But Indian villages typically had no such boundary markings, because the rights were common knowledge to the community. No one needed to know who was farming which land. And the best evidence for that, for any of you who have ever lived in a village, is that virtually every village in India where there are, because our fields are small, so there is no economic possibility of fencing them around, there is a custom, standard custom across most of India, that during agricultural seasons, one won't let free cattle out, for grazing. They won't. There was no law necessary. There was no law saying that protect his property rights. It was a recognized custom that we are all farming together, we are all living together, we all have cattle together. If you are going to let cattle out when somebody else is farming, that's going to create a problem. So no one did it. Today, exactly the same thing I am seeing in many villages. As people are fencing for various reasons, today they can afford it, the land plots may have grown larger, there are less cattle, all that reason. But the sense of community is breaking down because we as members of the community are selectively counting on the law and our connections to power to ensure that the law favors us if in case there is a challenge.
Jaina?
I am very critical of law. I am really appalled that I am looking at law in this manner. My wife would be shocked since she is a lawyer too.
I think Barun did partly answer it by placing the responsibility on Amit, but I will ask the question. I can see that I appreciate the sentiment. I agree with you that at least today one way to minimize harms would be to recognize how we all have ingenious ways of resolving issues and challenges. So there are several examples of even private mechanisms of protecting property rights. People are able to address their issues by informal norms, rules and customs. So that happens in the case of farmers, also happens in the case of street vendors. The challenging part is when you have to fight the state. So amongst each other, people are able to figure out a way to operate. But when you have to fight the state, which I think was the case in pre-2014, I think, and Amit would know this better, the reason why there was this push for the law was not because we wanted a register of street vendors, but because one arm of the state was bullying vendors, where there was a presumption of illegality, where the public officials would remove you and not let you vend because you're assumed to be legal. And in that case, despite the campaigning, it's not like the street vendors could fight the police. And so we called upon another arm of the monster to help tell them that no, here is the law to tell you that these are indeed legal. So, and perhaps we assumed naively so that would work. It didn't work. There still has. But yeah, I'm just thinking that how can we build that community front against the state? Then do we not have to use their weapons, which is the law, to restrict them?
I can only say, I will not go into the law issue. I can only say something that I have discussed with Kumar quite a few times over the last few years, and which I think goes to what you have been looking for and what Saurav also said. How many times do you think, for all of us individually, forget about the circumstance, do we have or do we want or have we looked for spaces where we could meet, discuss, talk without an agenda, without an issue to go to battle for? Whenever we come to CCS, for instance, we can have an agenda that this is the project we are going to work on. You come to listen to a seminar in Habitat or IIC, you come to it because there is some issue or some author or something that interests you, and you listen to it, buy a book or whatever, take some notes and go back. When do we have the opportunity, the time, the inclination, the interest to engage in conversation with each other without an agenda, exactly like you said? In a street corner, coming from Bengal, a tea stall was a typical stall. Today it is largely impossible unless you belong to the same political or a social group that will meet and talk, because no one is sure what the other side is going to say. I grew up at a time when it was common for families to have two political sides and frankly debate it over on at their dinner table. Today it is impossible. we have to create that. There is no alternative. I don't think there is any alternative but for us to recognize that all of us have a responsibility to create that space for our own sanity, for our own community. That's what I've been telling you, that find a place where we can sit down without any organizational affiliations, just to read and talk, without an agenda, without a project to share and run with. We need that space too. We have lost sight of it because the law has made it happen. The law wants us to appeal to the power. So we are always thinking, that's why the elite don't have to bother, because they know whom to call. So it doesn't matter what the law is. You know whom to call, so the law will be implemented in that manner. Which is why there is no demolition in the Sainik farms, the most richest unauthorized colony in Delhi, where the bulldozers are there everywhere. So, I am not being pessimistic at all. I am saying we need to cultivate it from within, from ourselves, from our own surroundings. And I know it is very challenging, but to me that challenge should also be an exciting opportunity, which is the reason I thought that India was such an exciting place in the 1990s. Not because we were perfect, because there seemed to be so many things that were happening and that could happen. Because I am from the pre-90s generation, so I know what India that I grew up in. So I had no urge to leave this country, because I thought this is such an exciting place to be, a happening place. But today we cannot even meet to discuss. We cannot be sure who my neighbor is. And we look at the law to help us. We are writing our death sentence.
It's not a prescription, but just to add one more framework and conversation which has been there in recent times. So I've known CCS in 2008, on and off, and we have worked here and have been friends and passed through here all the time. The framework that I see most of the time in our conversation, in our work, whether it is iPolicy, public policy workshop that we do, etc., has mostly been the sort of flip between state and markets, and many books have come in the recent times where they have put the framework of Samaj, Bazaar and Sarkar. So this Samaj has been a new addition I see over the last 5-7 years. Gurcharan Das has written I don't think so. My bad. Raghuram Rajan has a book which he mentioned, Third Pillar. Rohini Nilekani has exactly same titled book. And that conversation, Parth has a talk now, which talks about like that in our programs. So this conversation about, and we are called Center for Civil Society, that conversation, and we have always, majority of our work has been trying to figure out, okay, minimizing the role of the state, but maximizing the role of the markets. And it's understood that within civil society, markets is there and also society is there. So individual and markets are there. But explicitly talking about community has been or working towards it, creating a more thriving space. And here I think about when I was working in the private sector, you realize, and when you're commenting on the economy, you use the word and the phrase crowding out all the time. That the moment the size of the state goes up or fiscal deficit is going up, that means the private sector is being crowded out. So maybe in my mind there is a framework, and Barun, correct me if I'm wrong, that Samaj, Bazaar, Sarkar, there is probably a distribution about 100, and so moment you occupy more of one, there will always be less of the other, and it is not as if all three can grow simultaneously and can thrive. So if Sarkar is occupying more of the space, by definition Samaj will have less of it. So crowding out of Samaj is taking place, and we have focused, I would assume, and of course we have written books about environment and community, all of that, but still I'd make a case that maybe a lot of focus has gone into talking about markets and state, and relying on a state to increase more economic freedom, and not enough conversation at all, probably not enough, definitely, about Samaj.
And to the extent Samaj has been included, it has been instrumental.
The same thing that we're talking about is really, there's a book called Bowling Alone.
Yes.
And that is exactly the way they had diagnosed a similar problem in America. That the diagnosis is why the rise of Trump, etc., is attributed to the decline in the vibrant local community, because people have, with the internet, they don't need to talk to each other. So in Americans are quite wonderful because they survey everything. So every year you are asked a question: when was the last time you had you had your neighbor over for dinner, and the decline they see of that, or similarly for other institutions. And I guess it's not easy. There's no sort of silver bullet here. But it would still, I would say, leave one a little more sort of, instead of feeling unsettled as we are feeling right now, if one could have some light at the end of the tunnel, uh, to pitch for. The diagnosis, I think, has been very well analyzed of the problem, and the answer, frankly, is not there. That's
Yet.
where I feel today.
I think the answer, the answer is an exploration. So it's not an answer as such. But I think, for instance, Kumar and I have talked a lot in the recent years on whether we can have libraries, for instance. Libraries.
A library,
A
a space.
reading and meeting, etc. Because again, from my childhood, and I'm sure some of you in Pune and elsewhere may have noticed it too, Bangalore, that my first trips to the library was with my grandmother in the late 1960s. Because there used to be neighborhood libraries, like public or private libraries, which were open. You could buy, read or borrow a book for a week or 10 days and return it. And that's how most of us read. I still remember, even in the city of Calcutta, newspapers would be stuck up on boards at the tea stalls, so that people could read both sides, because most people couldn't even afford the newspaper. Now, if one part of the problem is that we do not have the space, and I am suggesting not just the space, we have forgotten even the need for. But now, after this conversation, if we do really feel the need for a conversation that is open-ended, and that was one of the purpose of this conversation. It was not, I wouldn't have agreed to come if I was expected to provide a prescription. I'm not engaged in prescription because I am exploring. And to me, the excitement is because I am exploring, and therefore I am not disheartened. And one part of the exploration that I think all of us need to figure out, and as an institution, CCS could also perhaps, that whether in your specific project activities, education, or whichever area you are working on, one could conceive of creating spaces where people could meet and come as people, not as representing something else or pursuing some project, just to have a chat. That is what is a community. It is that bonding through that interaction which creates the framework and sustains all the rest. Which is why the Europeans in the 17th, 18th century, early 18th century were so surprised at seeing village republics functioning. Not that they were perfect. They had their all power equations and everything else. But it was possible because they were interacting with each other and trying to deal with each other's problems. We have lost that because we are always thinking through institutional design. Law and policy are two illustrations of that institutional design approach to thinking. We have to think of the human approach to things.
Sure. You take, then I'll
And
close.
how do we do it? And I think all of us have a role to play, because it's not a pill, like you said, it's not a silver bullet that we can offer. All of us have to experiment to figure out how do we create and nurture spaces of that kind, where people can meet as equal people. Most of us don't even have the time. We don't even think it is necessary.
Well, Gurcharan is doing his part. He is taking people on
similar kind of a study group, come chai pe charcha, and it was so very good, excellent. Convert this room into a kind of chai pe
So we have a space, and on Saturdays we will leverage that. And so all of you are welcome. We will set that up soon. You're welcome to have it. The other day I was talking to a couple of my colleagues, and the phrase that kind of captures for me that kind of discussion that we are having in Hindi, it's called "Aa bail mujhe maar." So in kind of many ways, sometimes we are always asking for state to help us out, and at that time, you realize that later, instead of helping us out, the state is always helping itself. So as liberals, probably we can be more skeptical about always asking for state for solution, and maybe the group meetings, etc., that we will do, hopefully that will throw up something more useful. So no prescriptions, but the other many P's we have talked about: philosophy, policy, practice, people, power, and politics. So one thing is missing so far right now. Immediate specific one is prescription. The prescription is a reading book and community, anything that fosters the community sense of community, and maybe sort of can help design something proper, which is urban governance work. So with that, we'll come to a close, and we'll have tea and samosa and snacks available. So you are welcome to join us, please.
Just one add to this. If I am looking for a solution from this 2 hours, that would be not just a common space at CCS. That whether out of the 20 of you here, 10 of you can think of such spaces in wherever you are. Yeah, that's one. That is of course one. So, wherever we are, because we have to practice what we are saying, not take advantage of what already exists and therefore think that no investment is necessary and free chai on Saturdays.
Yeah. So much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for bearing with me for 2 hours.